Isn't it wonderful that today brings me closer to my goals? Isn't it wonderful that I trust today will unfold beautifully? Isn't it wonderful that I start this day with peace inside me? Isn't it wonderful that I choose gentle thoughts this morning? Isn't it wonderful that I release yesterday with ease? Isn't it wonderful that today is a new beginning for me? Isn't it wonderful that I welcome fresh energy now? Isn't it wonderful that I feel supported by life today? Isn't it wonderful that I trust the flow of this day? Isn't it wonderful that everything is aligning for me? Isn't it wonderful that I am in the right place at the right time? Isn't it wonderful that things are working out in my favor? Isn't it wonderful that I move through today with grace? Isn't it wonderful that I feel balanced and centered? Isn't it wonderful that I respond calmly and wisely today? Isn't it wonderful that I feel confident and capable? Isn't it wonderful that I trust myself completely? Isn't it wonderful that I notice blessings everywhere? Isn't it wonderful that I feel grateful for simple things? Isn't it wonderful that joy finds me naturally today? Isn't it wonderful that I smile easily this morning? Isn't it wonderful that my heart feels light and happy? Isn't it wonderful that I am open to kindness and connection? Isn't it wonderful that people are kind and friendly to me? Isn't it wonderful that my interactions feel warm and easy? Isn't it wonderful that I attract supportive energy? Isn't it wonderful that I feel connected and cared for? Isn't it wonderful that my body feels healthy and strong today? Isn't it wonderful that I treat my body with love and respect? Isn't it wonderful that I have the energy I need? Isn't it wonderful that my body supports me so well? Isn't it wonderful that I feel good inside my body? Isn't it wonderful that today brings clarity and insight? Isn't it wonderful that I make good decisions easily? Isn't it wonderful that I trust my inner guidance? Isn't it wonderful that I am led to what's best for me? Isn't it wonderful that I feel aligned with my purpose? Isn't it wonderful that I allow myself to enjoy today? Isn't it wonderful that I take moments to breathe and relax? Isn't it wonderful that I give myself permission to go at my own pace? Isn't it wonderful that I honor my needs today? Isn't it wonderful that I feel gentle and patient with myself? Isn't it wonderful that today feels lighter than yesterday? Isn't it wonderful that I feel hopeful about what's coming? Isn't it wonderful that good things are on their way to me? Isn't it wonderful that I expect positive outcomes today? Isn't it wonderful that today feels full of promise? Isn't it wonderful that I am becoming my best self each day? Isn't it wonderful that I grow more peaceful and confident? Isn't it wonderful that I trust the journey of my life? Isn't it wonderful that everything is always working out for me? Isn't it wonderful that today is a beautiful gift? Isn't it wonderful that today feels calm and clear already? Isn't it wonderful that I woke up feeling peaceful inside? Isn't it wonderful that my heart feels light this morning? Isn't it wonderful that today brings me exactly what I need? Isn't it wonderful that everything is unfolding beautifully? Isn't it wonderful that I feel grounded and centered today? Isn't it wonderful that I trust the process of my life? Isn't it wonderful that I am open to new blessings now? Isn't it wonderful that my energy feels fresh and renewed? Isn't it wonderful that today supports my happiness? Isn't it wonderful that I am guided to the right place at the right time? Isn't it wonderful that I notice signs and synchronicities easily? Isn't it wonderful that solutions come to me naturally today? Isn't it wonderful that clarity is finding me this morning? Isn't it wonderful that I feel inspired and focused? Isn't it wonderful that I am attracting positive outcomes today? Isn't it wonderful that people are kind and supportive to me? Isn't it wonderful that my interactions are loving and respectful? Isn't it wonderful that I feel confident and capable today? Isn't it wonderful that I trust myself to handle whatever comes? Isn't it wonderful that I feel energized without feeling rushed? Isn't it wonderful that I move through my day with ease? Isn't it wonderful that I am patient and present this morning? Isn't it wonderful that I respond calmly to everything today? Isn't it wonderful that my thoughts are peaceful and supportive? Isn't it wonderful that I feel grateful for this moment? Isn't it wonderful that appreciation fills my heart today? Isn't it wonderful that I see beauty in small things? Isn't it wonderful that today feels gentle and kind to me? Isn't it wonderful that I feel safe and supported? Isn't it wonderful that I am aligned with what's best for me? Isn't it wonderful that I trust my intuition today? Isn't it wonderful that my inner guidance is clear? Isn't it wonderful that I make wise and loving choices? Isn't it wonderful that I feel in harmony with life? Isn't it wonderful that I am becoming more confident each day? Isn't it wonderful that I grow more peaceful and grounded? Isn't it wonderful that I treat myself with kindness today? Isn't it wonderful that I allow myself to go at my own pace? Isn't it wonderful that I honor my needs today? Isn't it wonderful that today brings progress without stress? Isn't it wonderful that I accomplish things with ease? Isn't it wonderful that I am productive and relaxed? Isn't it wonderful that I enjoy what I am doing today? Isn't it wonderful that my work feels meaningful? Isn't it wonderful that joy finds me in simple moments? Isn't it wonderful that laughter comes easily today? Isn't it wonderful that my heart feels open and warm? Isn't it wonderful that I give and receive kindness freely? Isn't it wonderful that I feel connected and supported? Isn't it wonderful that today feels fresh and full of promise? Isn't it wonderful that I expect good things today? Isn't it wonderful that I welcome positive surprises? Isn't it wonderful that today is full of opportunities? Isn't it wonderful that I am open to receiving them? Isn't it wonderful that I feel hopeful about my future? Isn't it wonderful that I trust everything is working out? Isn't it wonderful that I feel calm about what's ahead? Isn't it wonderful that today feels light and easy? Isn't it wonderful that I am exactly where I need to be? Isn't it wonderful that today is full of new possibilities? Isn't it wonderful that I woke up feeling refreshed and grateful? Isn't it wonderful that today is working out in my favor? Isn't it wonderful that good things are coming to me today? Isn't it wonderful that I am open to receiving blessings? Isn't it wonderful that I feel calm, confident, and supported? Isn't it wonderful that everything is unfolding perfectly today? Isn't it wonderful that I am guided to the right actions? Isn't it wonderful that today flows with ease and grace? Isn't it wonderful that I feel aligned and peaceful? Isn't it wonderful that opportunities are showing up for me today? Isn't it wonderful that I attract positive people and experiences? Isn't it wonderful that I feel motivated and inspired? Isn't it wonderful that I am productive with ease today? Isn't it wonderful that things are falling into place? Isn't it wonderful that I feel grateful for this beautiful day? Isn't it wonderful that joy is finding me everywhere today? Isn't it wonderful that I feel supported by life today? Isn't it wonderful that I trust the timing of my life? Isn't it wonderful that I am exactly where I need to be? Isn't it wonderful that my energy is bright and positive? Isn't it wonderful that I am radiating calm and confidence? Isn't it wonderful that people respond kindly to me today? Isn't it wonderful that my day is filled with pleasant surprises? Isn't it wonderful that I am attracting good news today? Isn't it wonderful that I feel safe and optimistic? Isn't it wonderful that my heart feels light and open? Isn't it wonderful that today is filled with small miracles? Isn't it wonderful that I notice blessings easily today? Isn't it wonderful that gratitude flows through me naturally? Isn't it wonderful that I am creating a beautiful day for myself? Isn't it wonderful that my thoughts are gentle and positive? Isn't it wonderful that I choose peace and joy today? Isn't it wonderful that I respond with calm and clarity? Isn't it wonderful that today feels simple and aligned? Isn't it wonderful that I trust myself and my decisions today? Isn't it wonderful that I am confident in who I am? Isn't it wonderful that I feel capable and supported? Isn't it wonderful that I attract success naturally? Isn't it wonderful that I am in the flow of life today? Isn't it wonderful that I feel energized and focused? Isn't it wonderful that my body feels healthy and strong? Isn't it wonderful that I treat myself with kindness today? Isn't it wonderful that I am patient and compassionate with myself? Isn't it wonderful that I am open to learning and growing? Isn't it wonderful that today brings clarity and insight? Isn't it wonderful that solutions are coming to me easily? Isn't it wonderful that I am guided toward the right opportunities? Isn't it wonderful that everything is always working out for me? Isn't it wonderful that I trust the flow of my life? Isn't it wonderful that I feel hopeful and excited about today? Isn't it wonderful that I expect good things to happen? Isn't it wonderful that my heart is filled with appreciation? Isn't it wonderful that today is kind to me? Isn't it wonderful that I am kind to myself? Isn't it wonderful that I am surrounded by supportive energy? Isn't it wonderful that I attract kindness wherever I go? Isn't it wonderful that today feels lighter and easier? Isn't it wonderful that I am becoming my best self each day? Isn't it wonderful that today is a beautiful day for me?